First of all, good afternoon to everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about digital epidemiology, right? That is a new area of study that is starting in the lab. And for that reason, I chose an article that is not very complicated. It's a quite simple one, but it's at the same time a very interesting article because it brings up some interesting points about digital epidemiology, some essential key points about epidemiology actually, and gives us an example of the potential or how we can use it as a science and also as a surveillance method. Basically, this is the article that we are going to talk about today. Let me just test this. For some reason, my PowerPoint is not working. Okay, now it works. Broadly speaking, digital epidemiology consists in applying mathematical modeling to different data streams, different data types, and try to gather and understand information with scientific value and epidemiological value in order for us to understand patterns and predict future disease outbreaks and things like that. As the name suggests, these data sources, these data streams, they are mainly digital. So instead of gathering data from traditional surveillance methods like clinical research, clinical trials, we gather data from Google search queries, from Twitter microblogs, news online, and other sources like that. And you can do a lot of different stuff with those sources, but for this study in particular, the authors were interested in creating what they call a nowcast. A nowcast is essentially a forecast, but considering the moment, not trying to predict the future too much into the future. I don't know if I'm being clear, but okay. So essentially, what they do here is they gather data from Google and Google search queries. They also gather data from epidemiological trials. They basically gather data from both data streams, the digital ones and the not digital ones, the traditional data sources, and they apply some mathematical modeling in order to predict disease outbreaks. So to give you guys some context, a few years back, there was a famous digital epidemiology initiative called Google Flu Trends, right? And Google Flu Trends, as the name suggests, was a tool for predicting influenza rates in the United States using Google queries, and it was implemented by Google itself. In the beginning, it was very interesting, it raised a lot of media attention, but with time, what happened is that Google Flu Trends started to misforecast some influenza outbreaks in both senses, like misforecasting too much, over forecasting, or under forecasting these outbreaks. And for that reason, what happened is that in 2005, Google Flu Trends ended its service, unfortunately, because it was a very interesting initiative. But there are some researchers that think that the algorithm behind Google Flu Trends was not that useful. Unuseful, I mean. There are several attempts in trying to improve this algorithm in order to give us better, more precise predictions of influenza and other diseases outbreaks using Google search queries data and also applying it to other data sources. So in this case, these authors, they gather one of these improved algorithms and they compare this algorithm with some other mathematical models. And so the Google Flu Trends improved algorithm is called Argo. It basically considers epidemiological data from Google search queries and also considers epidemiological data from clinical trials. And they compared with a naive autoregression model that consists on only epidemiological data, not considering Google search query data. And another model that they compared was the GT for Google Trends. That is a model that considers only digital search query from Google. So basically we have two models that uses digital data streams and one model that uses only traditional surveillance methods data streams. They applied these three models for yellow fever, Zika, Ebola plague, and cholera. And the motivation for doing so is that they gather some data from Google search queries, and as you can see in those graphs, for yellow fever, for Zika, Ebola, you can find a high correlation of Google search queries and the ground truth number of cases, as they call. And this is why this was also one of the main motivators for all the digital epidemiology stuff, because people understood that we can predict these outbreaks by how the population in general behaves in digital media sources. And in some cases, you have a very correlated behavior. In some other cases, a not so correlated one. But in general, you can see a behavior that correlates in some degree with what is happening in real life, with the number of real cases of a disease outbreak. So they took two approaches to compare these three models. The first one was considering a continuous flow of accurate epidemiological data, considering a 1 to 2 weeks delay. And why did they do it? Because when we are talking about how the real world works, like you don't have the data done. We can see that by the coronavirus pandemic now. The data comes daily, if so, and you don't have the data done. So you have to gather the data that you already have from the past, and then use this data to predict, to forecast, or do whatever mathematical modeling you want to do. And that's why they consider this continued flow of accurate epidemiological data. They already had the data because these were past outbreaks, but the simulation considered like emulated a real world situation. And the reason for the 1 to 2 weeks delay, it is because there are several studies that point out that in most cases, the time for the information about a number of cases for specific diseases usually takes 1 or 2 weeks to reach authorities, to reach data distribution sources because of several factors, because of logistics, because of a lot of issues that you find in this process of disseminating data about epidemiology outbreaks. So considering this first approach, overall, basically they compared these three models. As you can see here in this graph, the blue line is the AR. I think it's a little bit small here, but okay. The blue line is the ER model. The green line is the GT model. Red line is the Argo model. And this gray area is what they call the ground truth, which is the known number of epidemiological cases that were registered for that outbreak. And as you can see, they had, in some cases, they have a very similar response, prediction pattern. In other cases, you have some very different, some very dissonant prediction profiles of the outbreak. But overall, models that incorporate Google search data, they tend to outperform naive autoregression models. So just reminding, the Argo algorithm here, which has one of the highest indexes of correlation, it uses both data from Google Trends, Google search queries, and also epidemiological data that is available in considering that 1 to 2 weeks delay. And the GT algorithm also only Google data, and the AR only epidemiological data. The first column here, you can see that you have only a delay of 1 week. The second column, you have a delay of 2 weeks. And this delay, as you can see, causes some minor differences in the profile of the forecasting. And it's because basically of the amount of data that is available and the quality of data. But overall, the first result that they got from this analysis is that Google search seems to be a nice addition to these data sources. Google search queries seems to fill the gaps that epidemiological data sometimes cannot fill due to several factors. And this is interesting because it is one of the main points of digital epidemiology. This new area of study came not to, the idea is not to replace traditional surveillance methods, but it is to complement traditional surveillance methods. And these results show that we can actually have some improvement in how we can forecast these outbreaks when we consider Google search data. So here's a table. I'm not going to detail too much about it, but basically it brings values for Pearson correlation, root mean square error, and relative root mean square error. And looking at those tables, I can share this with you guys later. You can see that the Argo basically has a higher correlation factor and smaller error factors, relative root mean square error factors, which indicates that it overall has a better performance in predicting those diseases. So the second approach that they had was trying to emulate even more the real world. What do I say? How can I explain this? In the first case, they had the flow of data with the 1 to 2 weeks delay, but they were considering the ground truth data. I mean, the data that after the outbreak was consolidated, was pretty much clean, with no issues, no problems. In this case, they supplied the model, the algorithms with data that was unreliable, incomplete, trying to emulate how a real outbreak works in real life, because the data that comes from medical sources, it usually is not fully complete, is not fully reliable. In the case of this pandemic, we can see that the data is pretty reliable, but we have global efforts in trying to make the data very clear and very precise. But when we are talking about minor events, this is usually not the case. So here they applied the algorithm considering this unreliable flow of data source, right? And then after using this unreliable data as an input for the model, they compare the output with the ground truth, which is this first graph here. And as you can see, the interesting analysis of this graph is that for the major part of the outbreak, epidemiological data seems to be a stronger prediction factor, allowing for the algorithm to predict it better. It has more weight in the prediction, but in the beginning of the outbreak, some Google search query terms appear to have more weight, be more important when we are trying to predict what is going to happen using this kind of data. And this is very interesting because when we are talking about surveillance, when we are talking about warning authorities, the first signal here of cannot have this information here. So we can try to picture this in our situation today. Imagine if in the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, here in Brazil, we kind of had it because we saw it came from China, then Europe. But if you consider China, for example, if they had an early warning due to people researching for symptoms for some sort of flu-like disease, maybe they could have an even better result and even fewer deaths than they have in the period. And here in this case, they also compared the other algorithms, right? The GP model and the ER model, considering also the delay in the delivery of this data. So as you can see, we have this line here, dotted line, I think I forgot the term in English, which is the report release date. We have the yellow line, which is the next report date. And here, the black line is the reported epidemiological curve. So essentially, when you consider Google data or digital data in general, we can see that in some cases, considering only the epidemiological curve, the tendency, the prediction is that things were going to get better, things were going to, the curve was going to reduce. And the digital data streams suggested otherwise. They suggested that probably this would not be the case. So also another argument of how digital data streams can contribute with filling those gaps when we talk about digital epidemiological surveillance. So, and I basically said what this slide was going to say. but this is not a perfect model yet, which is another very important point, because one of the major issues with digital epidemiology today is how to handle the complexity that you find in data streams like Twitter or Google, because people search everything that you can think about. It is a data source that is under influence of media actions, of events in real life. So essentially, the sample of Google users or Twitter users or whatever social media users, it is not a homogeneous sample, it's not random. It represents a very defined part of the population. There is also cultural relevance. We can have all forms of bias when we are querying terms, especially when we are talking about Portuguese, because Portuguese is a very flexible language and is a major problem that must be addressed. And also the question about media coverage. So they also leveraged some data about the number of news that were being published in relation to the subject of those outbreaks. And as you can see, in some cases, there is a strong correlation with the amount of news that were published and how the Google queries behaved and how the search volumes behaved. So sometimes this is something that can spoil your analysis and must be taken in consideration as well. So basically that's it. It is a very simple article. It's not a very complex one. I think we can get more deep in mathematical modeling and other questions in future journal clubs. But as a beginning, I think this article summarizes very well what is digital epidemiology, how it kind of works, and where do we want to get using digital epidemiology. And basically that's it. So thank you guys. And if you guys have any questions, I'm all yours.
That's awesome, Vitor.